Okay, welcome to Lesson 10. This lesson is on the developing arms race that begins, well, it doesn't begin, it continues in
Develops even.
in earnest throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, which leads us to, as we alluded to last lesson, the origins of what becomes known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, really the highest point in tensions in this whole Cold War. So where do we begin? The first thing is we're just going to do a quick recap. How did relations become worse up to this point? Number one, you got to remember things like the Berlin blockade, which led to the airlift, the Korean War, the Hungarian uprising. All of these things make these actual events make things worse. Of course, the formation of military alliances in the form of NATO and the Warsaw Pact were in some sense admissions that the future the USSR and the USSA might end up at war with each other, and they needed to sort of protect their house by getting themselves allies. And also another key point is the fact that by 1953 both sides possess hydrogen bombs, which are 8,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
So, this story starts with that little guy in the picture, Sputnik. The Russians launched the satellite Sputnik into space. Now, this is essentially, what you see there is what it is. It's a little ball with some antennae. It's not a threat. It's really like, it's basically like sending your washing machine up into space, okay? It's really a marginal thing. But actually, the American public, being the American public, go absolutely crazy about this because it's seen as, like, can it drop nuclear bombs? What does this tell us? But worse than that,
it's symbolically important.
It's symbolic because the Americans always knew the Russians had more people. They always knew from World War II that Russians had their strength was in their sort of gritty men. But America was always going to win any war because they had the technology. They had all the stuff which could kill hundreds of Russians very easily, and therefore actually they were safe. Now, Sputnik being sent to space, almost without warning, suggests that actually maybe the USA is not ahead anymore in this technology race and this sort of development of technology, and therefore this whole thing which had insulated the American public from the threat of Russia, i.e., well, if they come at us, we've got good tanks, we've got good aircraft, etc., 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 then that does not work anymore. And this gives an impression that USA was behind on the missile race and the science race. In reality, they were probably behind on what will be soon to known as the space race, who can get the most into space, who can get the most of things in space, or furthest in space, or whatever, how you define the yardstick, to vary time to time. But the image that the USA was behind the missile race is not true. And that the USA behind the science race, apart from the space areas, the science, is also not true. But despite this, obviously the USA, responding to public pressure, Eisenhower increased spending on the sort of missiles by 20%, and Eisenhower in 1958 founds NASA, the National Aeronautical and Space Administration, to try and win and wrestle back the space race.
Interesting fact about NASA that it's the most frequently understood acronym in this entire course. Most people think it stands for the North American Space Agency, but it's not. It's the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Get it right. Sputnik is also an important cultural reference point. When I was a mere 12 years old, the band Snap came out with the song The Power, which starts like this.
Американская фирма Transceptor Technology приступила к производству компьютеров «Персональный спутник».
It's all about building your cultural capital. There you go. That is Snap's The Power. You can watch the full extended Sputnik version on YouTube.
Does not count revision, though.
No, and it probably won't get you any marks in an exam, but if Mr. Raine wants to take you back to the great year that was 1991, when I was a mere 12 years old, you just need to listen to Snap. Another good song is Rhythm is a Dancer by Snap. I remember in 1993, that was #1 on the Much Music Countdown in Canada.
Songs that we like. Yeah. Okay, songs popular in Canada. Anyway, so the USA starts spending more money on weapons as well. They expand training programs for engineers and scientists. The US Air Force increases the number of B-52 bombers, which are the ones, as you can see there, which drop lots of bombs, but particularly nuclear bombs. As well as that, equips some submarines with nuclear weapons and polar Ares missiles, as they're called, which the idea that, yes, they might be able to nuke all the missile silos in America, but no one knows where these nuclear submarines are, and so they can emerge anywhere in the world and then fire their missiles, and there's nothing the Russians could do about it. As well as that, they've placed missile batteries. Can I have a foreshadowing noise, please? It's not foreshadowing, but okay. That in missile bases in developing countries, notably Turkey.
Why would Turkey be a problem?
We'll soon see.
Well, in response, events in one of America's closest neighbors, Cuba, begin to bring the two nations in the world closer and closer to nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which will take place over 13 days in October 1963. But we need to know how we got to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it didn't happen out of nowhere. Where it really begins is in 1959 in what becomes known as the Cuban Revolution. Cuba was owned, or run rather, by a dictator named Batista, and Batista was largely backed by the United States, who basically kept him in power in order to prevent the Cuba from falling into the hands of the communists. The United States was very, very aware that their neighbor, only 80 miles south of the United States in the Caribbean Sea, was, I guess, amongst the overwhelming majority of the citizens, a popular movement towards communism. And they decided to prop up a dictator named Batista, who used a relatively repressive regime to keep control. That all sort of came to an end in 1959 as Batista was unable to keep a lid on things. And a revolution led by these two individuals. On the left, you have Ernesto Che Guevara. You may have seen him on T-shirts if you've ever been around Camden. And to his right, Fidel Castro, to basically lead a revolutionary movement to overthrow the U.S.-backed government of Batista. Castro and Guevara are successful. They eject all U.S. businesses from Cuba. And in retaliation, the USA starts to, do things like not buy Cuban sugar, not buy Cuban cigars. So they're two largest exports.
I think something very interesting about this is, in part, America. You have them like Fidel Castro and Che Guevara are left wingers, but they're not communist at this point. They actually want to sort of try and play off communism and capitalism to try and get the best deal from both. However, one of the businesses Castro ejects is United Fruit. United Fruit is a very, very powerful sort of conglomerate at this point, which has a lot of influence in Washington. And they and the big sort of retaliation of the USA, of the buying Cuban sugar, comes from the lobbyists of United Fruit, who decide to really try and punish Cuba for their taking their stuff. Interesting, not the first time that corporate interests will affect policy in a negative light, because what all that means is that Castro has to decide, well, if capitalism is going to spur me, I'll just join the USSR. And increasingly, he sides the USSR, eventually declaring that he, in fact, is a communist, almost out of nowhere. And I think the thing to understand about Castro is he is a man who is pragmatic. He's not necessarily an ideologue. Yes, he's left-wing, but the Americans could have avoided the Cuban crisis altogether had a little bit more of a nuanced line when dealing with Castro.
So Khrushchev automatically steps in and starts buying en masse Cuban sugar. He sees the potential for a friend very close to the United States.
Very close.
Very, very enticing to the Russian leader, who wants to put pressure on a man he believes is fundamentally weak. He wants to try to, as he says, once again outmaneuver Kennedy. In Khrushchev's mind, I suppose, he believes that his building of a wall in Berlin effectively outmaneuvered John F. Kennedy. He wants to try it again. He wants to push the young American leader. And it's also important to consider that a lot of the background for this comes from the fact that he was becoming increasingly under pressure in Russia. Some of the hardliners in the Communist Party, including some external members of the Communist Party, most more acutely Mao Zedong, were pushing him to take a very hard line against the United States. They're seeing that since Stalin's death, the USSR is potentially becoming threatened both internally and externally. So he's under pressure from what become known as hardliners, people who want him to be more like Stalin. And many in the USSR are beginning to be angry about Western involvement in their sphere of influence, of course. They point to Berlin still existing and the existence of a West Berlin as an incursion on their sphere of influence. And the placing of U.S. missiles in Turkey. Turkey is a country that borders Russia, very, very close to the Crimea and the Caucasus region of southern Russia, very economically important in terms of oil and shipping. The fact that the United States has missiles just on their border really, really upsets them, and Cuba potentially could become a place where the Russians could get one over on the U.S.
And it's really important to realize, actually, Russia has a case here. Like, Khrushchev's entire thing is, well, we'll fund them. What can the Americans do? They're doing the exact same thing in Berlin, to be honest, we're not causing any problems. This is a country can decide to become communist if it so likes. Obviously, Khrushchev knows that this is actually not going to go down like that. But it's not as if they are aggressively taking land. The people, the Castro, like Batista was very unpopular. He was overthrown by Guevara and Castro with wide-scale popular support, and then they've chosen, because of US mismanagement, to go communist. Now, in reality, you need to understand Khrushchev's game. Khrushchev doesn't really care about Cuba, really, and he understands that in the event of a war, he won't be able to defend it. However, it is now a beautiful bargaining chip. He can start trading that off, saying, well, you know what, I'm not attached to Cuba, but you need to sort of give me Berlin, or you need to sort out these missiles in Turkey. And Khrushchev is pushing Cuba and supporting Cuba as much in order to sort of use as part of the wider game of the Cold War, rather than anything to do with Cuba itself. He doesn't actually really like Castro, for example, and Castro doesn't really like him either.
So what this leads to is the United States trying to do something about this new Castro-led government. And what we get is what's known as the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and this is a quite important thing. By 1961, under Kennedy, the U.S. breaks off all diplomatic relations with Cuba, which means that effectively the governments don't communicate. Relations are so bad that they don't even have an embassy. Anybody who's working in a Cuban political office in the United States is forced to leave the country. Diplomatic relations are over, and these people have to return to Cuba, and vice versa for the United States. The United States decides that this Castro-led government is too close. It's too much of a threat. So what they try to do is they plan a scheme, mostly led by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to overthrow Fidel Castro. What they do is they take Cuban exiles, the people who were friends of Batista, and there are hundreds of thousands of them living mostly in and around Miami, Florida, and then what they want to do is they want to train these people as soldiers to invade Cuba, and the CIA would provide the training, the support, the Americans would provide the weapons and the boats to get over. The plan was, I suppose, for these exiles to land in Cuba to initially fight off what the Americans considered a relatively weak Cuban army and start their own uprising against Castro. The exiles called themselves La Brigada 2000 or 2506 or 2506, and they numbered 1,500 men. The CIA thought that they could get away with this, but what it leads to is an absolute and utter disaster.
So I think at this point it's important to realise that, number one, the 1,500 men is not enough to take Cuba. And it's not because the CIA are being stupid per se. They believe that all it requires is an initial invasion to force the Cuban people to realise that, yes, their liberty is at hand, and they will throw off the shackles of their sort of communist oppressors. This is really much based on like their almost wishful notion that everyone hates communism, right? Like, of course, people are going to look forward to it.
It's really quite a naive strategy on the part of the CIA.
And as well as that, their entire success, at least in the first few weeks, will depend on air support. That's air attacks and bombings from Americans, something which, as we shall see, will be a real problem. In fact, the CIA turns out was completely wrong when it thought that the Cubans would rise up. Most Cubans were actually relatively happy with the regime, particularly in these early years, because they've just seen the gains of almost all that land and stuff being taken from the foreign companies, which owned the majority of Cuba at the time, being given to them. They see their quality of life improving. Castro was popular, and as well as that, Castro, because he had advanced knowledge of the invasion, because everyone in Miami was talking about that invasion we are going to be on, and turns out there's more than a few Cuban spies around there, he was already well prepared to react. So that the invasion didn't really get off the ground. So we've got a situation now where we've got 1,500 men invading a huge country where they're vastly superior and well prepared, and also expecting a new army. This is made even worse for these sort of invaders by the fact the USA decide that they're not going to attack the Cuban Air Force, because that would make the USA's involvement too obvious. They don't want to use their sort of air wings and their sort of bombers and their fighter jets, because Kennedy at the last minute decides that if this all goes wrong, he wants something called plausible deniability. The idea that he can deny it and people will broadly believe it, or at least there is, it's not ridiculously lying. So there is, the export that there is really limited. It's basically CIA operatives in rented planes throwing bombs from the window. Like, that's it, not proper bombers. And without this air supply, without these air cover, the Cuban supply ships the supply ships of the brigade get sunk, and the brigade also gets entirely massacred on the ground. The Cuban army of 20,000 has superior arms, organization, leadership, and therefore is pretty much a foregone conclusion due to the combination of CIA naivety, Castro's foreknowledge, and the fact that Kennedy at last minute prevaricates and doesn't use the air wing.
So Castro begins to reach out to the USSR. He's obviously
straight after the
incredibly alarmed with the fact that the United States would try something so brazen to overthrow him. And it really convinces him that the US would eventually take it to the next level, that they would eventually try and kill him, or perhaps even this would lead to, the Bay of Pigs that is, lead to a further invasion where the United States sends their massive army over to Cuba and gets rid of him. So he starts to make overtures to Nikita Khrushchev, and he basically is asking for Soviet protection in the event of the United States potentially overthrowing him. And in December 1961, Castro declares that he is converted to communism, and that the country of Cuba, which he is now running since the revolution, would become a communist country. Of course, this threatens all of the bits of the United States' own sort of oh gosh, what the word I'm looking for is, it scares the crap out of the United States. It is, and it's a spread of communism. It's a spread of communism 80 miles off their border. You must reference things like the Truman Doctrine to think that the United States is going to need to do something about this. By the end of 1961, the Soviets had already put military advisors. These are people who can teach the Cuban army how to, build weapons, set up a stronger defense, etc. And they had put their own soldiers in Cuba.
And this is an important thing, because by putting soldiers in there, you're sending two messages. We will defend you, but we will defend you even if we don't want to now. Because if America invades or bombs or whatever, Soviet soldiers will get killed. And what will Khrushchev or whatever leader, even if they don't want to be forced to do, they'll be forced to respond. Sending soldiers in is a deliberate act. It's more than just, we'll protect you. It's a statement to the world that we are investing everything in this, and you better not come at us. So, what happens shortly afterwards is, and what we're ending here, we're moving on to the this sort of actual crisis itself in due course, is that Khrushchev sees that Cuba as a start of spreading communism to Central and South America. Latin America famously has resented the dictatorships which have been set up and will be continued to be set up by Americans, and also are dirt poor with very unequal distribution of wealth. Fantastic for communist insurgency. He is also concerned about missile bases in Turkey, and actually thought that if he was to put missiles in Cuba, all that would do is cause a balance of power. And remember, all of this, Khrushchev is thinking about the long game. Part of the reason he ultimately would decide to put missiles into Cuba is because he sees it as a way of upping the value of his bargaining chip. It's one thing saying, well, we've got Cuba. It's another thing saying, well, we've got Cuba with missiles that can blow you up, and then bargaining from there. Throughout 1962, he sends more and more military supplies and advisors to defend Cuba, and then the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis proper, on the 14th of October, the Americans finally get wise to the fact that actually the Soviets have been putting IRNBMs, or the sort of intermediate range nuclear missiles, essentially nuclear missiles which can shorten their range but still can from there hit most of America. And there was an estimation of the CIA that these will be ready for shooting in November. And it's important to realise that these IRBMs would be able to hit most US cities and were a huge threat. And this therefore catalyses what we'll see soon in the second, which is a desperate, rapid response over 13 days to try and deal with this crisis, which brings America and Russia probably closest to nuclear war, at least until the 1980s, that they've ever been. So what is Khrushchev doing here? Is he defending Cuba? Not really. I mean, it's important to keep Cuba going so communism is able to spread. It doesn't send a good message to communism if it's crushed by America. But more than that, Cuba is only one small pawn in the big power politics between Khrushchev and America. It's a way of getting equality and balance with the Americans for their missiles in Turkey, but as well as that, it's a potential tool in order to try and pressure America into giving in elsewhere in return for sorting out Cuba.
So what brings this all to a head? Well, the United States spy planes, of course, flying over Cuba and looking at what the Russians are doing in Cuba, discovered that medium-range ballistic missiles, those sort of intermediate IRBMs as they're known, are being placed in Cuba, and they're almost ready to, in a position to be, I guess, deliverable or fireable at the United States. So that's where we leave this off. The Cuba has become communist. The communists or the Soviets are putting missiles in Cuba. The Americans are gravely concerned, and we will sort of play you out by playing what is actually one of my favorite little bits of historical music. The fact that under Batista, interestingly enough, Cuba had developed a relatively flourishing cultural scene, particularly around music. The influence of American jazz was huge in Cuban music. Well, a lot of these people were forced to flee and find themselves in Miami. One of the groups that it flees and actually never gets to return because most of them are dead now, some group called the Bonavista Social Club. And they released a relatively successful album that won a few Grammys in about 1996. And we'll play you out on the Bonavista.
If you can't hear this on YouTube, it's because YouTube have blocked it.
That's the Bonavista Social Club with Chan Chan. I didn't play the whole song, but you get the idea. Really great album. You should listen to it.